I'm sitting there poking away. I'm thinking, I thought this was so easy. It's so easy on TV. You know, it takes like, 30 seconds. And I'm poking, I'm scratching the paint, and I'm making a big mess. I turn around, it's some 18-year-old kid, and this is what he says. He says, "Hey, mister, do you need help jacking that car?" And to which I said, "Don't tell me you just got out of prison for auto theft, right?" He says, "Nope, they've never caught me." And he opens up my lock. And I found out the key to beautiful sermon illustrations is stupidity.
Welcome to Church of the Rock from Winnipeg. Stay tuned to this week's thought-provoking message from Pastor Mark Hughes.
And welcome to week 4 of 40 Days of Praise. And this has been a great ride. Week 1, we talked about the praise craze. Week 2, worship. Week 3, a choice to rejoice. And today, thanks in advance. And I'm excited because I get to talk about one of my 3 favorite subjects. And I have 3 principles that I try to live by, 3 biblical principles. And you're going to recognize these because you hear them again and again. And the first one is this, and that is to forgive everybody all the time. And that comes from Jesus' non-negotiable principle of forgiveness. The second one is what I call the inverted law, and that's to respond to people in the opposite spirit that they respond to you, meaning to love your enemy, to do good to those who hate you, to pray for those who spitefully use you and persecute you, etc. And the last one is the attitude of gratitude. And that's what our subject on Thanksgiving is, and I'm excited to be able to talk about that. Part of praise is this thing called Thanksgiving. Now, here's the story. I want to tell you this story, and then it's going somewhere. And the story goes like this. There was this woman, and she was at work. She gets a call from her sister who's taking care of her child, and her child's sick, and she needs to go pick her up. So she swings by the pharmacy to pick up some medication, and what she ends up doing is locking her keys in the car. And now she's in a bit of a panic. She phones her sister. She tells her what's happened. Her sister says, "Go find a coat hanger and jimmy the lock." And so she goes, "Oh, okay." So she goes in, and they give her a coat hanger. She goes out, and she's poking away at this thing. She realizes she's not getting it open. And so then she prays, and this is how she prayed. She said, "Lord, I thank you that you will send the right person along to help me with this." And then just then, this very rough-looking character comes walking up. And she says, "Could you help me with this?" He said, "Sure, I can help you." In like 2 seconds flat, he pops that lock open. And so she says, "Oh, thank you, sir. You are a very nice man." And he starts laughing and says, "You know what? Nobody's ever called me a very nice man, because it turns out I just got out of jail for grand theft auto. What do you say to that?" And she says, "Well, I thank God even more, because not only did he send me help, he sent me a professional." So that's a good story. It's funny. And so I saw that story. Now here's where this gets weird. I thought that's a perfect story, and I put it in my notes. And then I jumped in my vehicle, and I came down to the church, because we were doing a little video shoot here at the end of the day. And I got down here, and when I went to leave the building, guess what? I had locked my keys in my car. I have never done that. Not once in my entire life. And I thought, that's weird. Is this some sort of Freudian power of suggestion thing? So then I phoned Kathy, and I said, "Kathy, can you come and bring the other set of keys and open up the door?" She said, "All right." She gets in her car, drives through 5 o'clock traffic to get down here, opens my vehicle, and goes back home. And I thought, well, that was dumb, but at least I got through it. Now here's where it gets even weirder. So the next day, I had to go out of town. I drove out of town, and I was sitting in my vehicle, and I was trying to figure out if I was in the right location. I was looking at my phone. I realized I was. I got out of my vehicle, slammed the door, and for the second time in 2 days, I locked my keys in the car. Again. And I was going, seriously? I did this 2 days in a row? And I thought, am I going crazy? Am I losing my mind? Or is this some way karma punishing me for not being thankful enough yesterday when it happened? And I thought, no, I don't believe in karma. So that means I am going crazy. And then it came to me. I knew exactly what to do. I couldn't phone Kathy. She's too far away. So I phoned CAA. And so I pulled out my card and I phoned CIA, and they said, "Sir, your card expired 2 years ago." I said, "How could it have expired? I still have the card." "Well, apparently you have to pay that membership every year." Who would have known? So then I'm thinking, and then it came to me. This is how quick I am. The coat hanger trick. So I went into the store and I got a coat hanger and straightened it out, and I'm sitting there poking away. I'm thinking, I thought this was so easy. It's so easy on TV. You know, it takes like, 30 seconds. And I'm poking, I'm scratching the paint, and I'm making a big mess. And I'm thinking, this isn't working. And then I thought, the rest of the story. And I said, "Lord, I thank you that you will send me just the right person to help." And then I stood there with the coat hanger and waited. And I'm looking both ways, waiting for the rugged-looking man to come along, And so looking, nobody's coming. I'm thinking, this is not working. And so I go back to it, and I'm poking away for like about another 20 minutes, and I'm not getting anywhere. All of a sudden, I hear this voice behind me. I turn around, it's some 18-year-old kid, and this is what he says. He says, "Hey, mister, do you need help jacking that car?" And to which I said, "Don't tell me you just got out of prison for auto theft, right?" He says, "Nope, they've never caught me." And he opens up my lock. And I thought, how could this be? And I found out the key to beautiful sermon illustrations is stupidity. That's the secret. So here we are. We're in Matthew chapter 15. We're going to talk about the power of thanks in advance. And so here it is, Matthew 15. We're going to start at verse 32. Then Jesus called his disciples to him and said, "I have compassion on the multitude because they have now continued with me 3 days and have nothing to eat. And I do not want to send them away hungry, lest they faint on their way." Then his disciples said to him, "Where could we get enough bread in the wilderness to fill such a great multitude?" Jesus said to them, "How many loaves do you have?" And they said, 7 and a few little fish. And he commanded the multitude to sit on the ground. Now listen to this carefully. He took the 7 loaves and the fish, and here it is, and gave thanks. Broke them and gave them to his disciples, and the disciples gave them to the multitude. So they all ate and were filled, and they took up 7 baskets full of fragments that were left. Now those who ate were 4,000 men, besides women and children. So here we have this story. We have Jesus out preaching in the wilderness. People have followed him. They've followed him for 3 days. They have nothing to eat, and they're still listening to him after 3 days. I'm thinking about what goes on around here. I preach for half an hour. After that, people are looking at their watch. They think, if we don't get out of here by noon, the Baptists are going to beat us to Stella's, and everybody starts getting nervous, Jesus has got people following him for 3 days without eating. And Jesus decides he's not going to send them home hungry. So he asks the disciples, "What do you got?" They've got 7 loaves, a few fish, which would, if you think about it, would have been enough food for maybe the 13 of them. That's how I would have handled it. The staff should eat before we leave. That's not what Jesus does. Jesus takes the bread, breaks the bread, and gives thanks. Now, remember what he's doing. He's giving God thanks in the fact that they don't have enough. And yet, because he gave thanks in advance, God did the most incredible miracle, or one of the most incredible miracles in the whole New Testament, is that 4,000 men, plus women, plus children, probably 10,000 people, all had enough to eat, and 7 baskets left over. That's the power of thanks in advance. And so that's why we want to learn to be grateful people to God for what he does, but not after he's done it. I mean, you do it then, but also before. Now, before I jump to the end of this, the conclusion of that, I want to give us the rudiments of this, because we really need to become grateful people in the process, not just people who are looking for a great outcome. So here's what I'm going to put up. Here's the paradigm for us today. The first one is this: Thanksgiving makes for a better you. Thanksgiving makes for a better life. And the last thing is that Thanksgiving makes for a better outcome. So let's begin at the beginning. And that is that Thanksgiving actually makes us better people. I want to remind you of a story. It's in Luke chapter 17. And there's 10 lepers. And they come to Jesus. And Jesus gives them the most peculiar instruction. And he says to them, Go show yourselves to the priests, and they depart. Now, there was a reason for that. According to the Mosaic law, the priests and only the priests could declare someone free of leprosy. So Jesus was actually fulfilling the Old Testament law by saying, now go show yourself to the priests. So the 10 leave, and it says, as they went, all 10 of them were cleansed of their leprosy. And then sometimes later, what happens is we have one of them, and only one, who returns to Jesus, and it says that he fell down at Jesus' feet, and he glorified God in a loud voice, and he gave thanks unto God. And then Jesus says, were there not 10 that were healed? Where are the other 9? You know what? Jesus wasn't disappointed very often in people. A few times with Peter and his disciples. But you know, when he healed people, when he ministered to people, you rarely see him disappointed. But this is one of the times where he's actually a bit incredulous. He says, where are the other 9? Were there not 10 of you that were healed? Where are they? And I want you to understand what was at stake here. Because these people were lepers in a day where lepers were outcasts from society. You can't think of a worse situation than being a leper in Jesus' day. It was insult to injury because you were an outcast and you walked down the streets going unclean, unclean, and no one was even allowed to touch you. Not only were you sick, not only were you diseased, but you were ostracized from society. I want you to put that in perspective. Could you imagine how your life would change if you were healed? How if leprosy all of a sudden was gone from you and the priest declared you well, your life would be transformed. And yet, only one of the 10 returned to give thanks to Jesus. Now here's where I'm going with this. I want to ask you a question, and I want you to be really honest with me. How many of you would like to think that if you were one of those lepers, you would have been the one to return? Let me see your hands. Come on, be honest with me. Be honest. A bunch of you aren't putting up your hand because you know this is going, right? You know, I would like to think I would be that one. I would like to think I would be the one that would be grateful, but statistically speaking, it's not true. 90% would carry on with their life. And I'm telling you something, as someone, a minister of the gospel, I've actually seen this again and again. And I too am disappointed and surprised when I see it. And the reason is, and here's what I think, is that I think gratitude is actually learned behavior. I don't think we come by it naturally. I think that that's what that story illustrates, that unless somebody teaches us gratitude, we're not really going to know. And I was reminded of it this week, and I'll tell you why, because this week I became a grandfather. And I know what you're thinking, so I'll just say it for you. You're thinking, he doesn't look old enough to be a grandfather. And I know, thank you for saying that. I appreciate that. And so our middle daughter, our middle child gave birth this week, a bouncing baby boy, all 10 pounds of him. Yeah, or almost 10 pounds. That's a big baby to squeeze out, let me tell you. And but Mama's doing great, and Baby's doing great, and Grandma, Kathy's doing great. Grandpa's not sure he likes the title and hasn't settled on that at all. But everybody's doing well. But anyway, having this newborn around reminded me of something. And it reminded me of the fact that gratitude is actually not part of our human nature. And it's not something we're born with, and it's something that is learned behavior. Because I want you to think about this, and maybe you don't remember, but I think you'll know the story. What was the first thing you did when you came into this world? Do you remember? Yeah, you cried. You cried when you were born, you cried when you were cold, you cried when you were tired, you cried when you were hungry, you cried when you were poopy, you cried when you went off to first grade, and then you cried again when you're 35 and your parents kicked you out of the house, right? Or in some cases, one guy this morning said 39, and so good for him. And that's my old routine. You've heard me say that many times before, but I don't want you to miss this, that it actually is not natural for us to be grateful people. Gratitude is something we have to learn. And how many of you grew up in one of those houses where your parents instilled it in you and they told you, please and thank you, please and thank you? How many grew up in one of those houses? How many have the same parents I did? And not all of us grew up in those homes. And today you look at it and it's sort of remarkable because you see less and less, and you see a lot of kids today, not here I hope, but you see a lot of kids out in our world today that are actually entitled and ungrateful and rude at times, and it's startling to me. And it's all because the parents have not done a good job of instilling the values of gratitude, because like I said, it's not natural for us. We have to learn to do these things. And, I don't know, those of you, again, talking about our childhood, some of you remember a birthday party 30 and 40 years ago. This was a birthday party. You only needed 3 things. You needed hot dogs, a cake, and a cutout paper donkey, and a pin with a tail on it. And it was so much fun because, you take a 6-year-old kid and you put a blindfold on them, spin them around in a circle, put a sharp object in their hand and say, go poke something. I mean, it's the most fun you can have for $1, right? But you know what? If you were to pull off a birthday party like that today, they would chase you out of the Montessori school. I'll tell you that right now. And you're going to do a birthday party for kids today, you know what you're going to need? You're going to need a full-size inflatable Disney castle. You're going to need exotic zoo animals with a trainer to show them off. You're going to need helicopter rides for the kids. You're going to have a whole platoon of acrobats and live clowns. And then after they finish the custom-ordered sushi, gluten-free and non-GMO, then what you do is you give them the goodie bag with $100 worth of candy in it and a PlayStation 4. And you do it all because even though you're required to take out a second mortgage to pay for it, it's all worthwhile because 2 of those 7 children said thank you, right? And you know which 2 they are because you know the parents. Because it's all a matter of how we bring up those children. And let me let you in a little secret you probably know, is that ungrateful children grow up into ungrateful adults. Harry Ironside was a Canadian who went down to Chicago and pastored the great Moody Bible Church some years ago. And he was in a crowded restaurant in Chicago, and he was having his meal, and he was by himself eating lunch, and it was so crowded that people were just sitting at different people's tables, and so he had someone right across the table from him. And so he bowed his head to give thanks for his food, and when he did that, the person across said, oh, is there something wrong with the food? And he said, oh, no, the food's fine. And he says, are you not well? And he says, what do you mean, am I not well? He says, I noticed you bowed your head. Are you okay? Are you sick? He said, no, I bowed my head to give thanks for my food. And the man said, oh, you're one of those people. He says, you know what, let me tell you something. I work hard for a living, and I work hard for my money, and I don't feel like I have to bow my head to anybody or anything, and when it's time to eat, I just dig right in. To which Harry Ironside said, you know what, I got a dog like that. He does the same thing. Thanksgiving makes for a better you. The second thing is Thanksgiving makes for a better life. There was a Canadian stress researcher at the University of Montreal. He was a professor there, and his name was Hans Seil. He was very famous in the 30s and 40s, and he discovered some wonderful things about stress and that we all face stress, and the real key is how you deal with stress in life. And so this is what he came up with. He came up with what he considered the 2 most powerful emotions, human emotions. And I'm just going to ask you, if you had to guess, what would be the 2 most powerful human emotions? What would they be? Love and hate. That's what I would think. That's what most people would think, but that's not what he said. He said the 2 most powerful human emotions are revenge and gratitude. And he said revenge always produces bitterness and hatred and frustration. But he says gratitude actually produces peace and fulfillment and forgiveness. And he talked about how those 2 things actually stand in opposition to one another. And I was thinking about that because one of the texts we've been using in this series on praise is Philippians chapter 4, which says, be anxious or stressful for nothing, but in everything with prayer and supplication with thanksgiving. Let your requests be made known unto God, and the peace of God which surpasses all understanding will guard your heart and your mind. Did you catch that? Anytime we pray, anytime we worship, we do it in a spirit of thanksgiving. And it is that spirit or that attitude of gratitude that actually allows us to move in this whole place where we can overcome the power of anxiety and where we can overpower and overcome the power of stresses in our life. Some of you will know the name Matthew Henry. He was a Bible commentator. And one day on his way home, he was robbed by some thieves, and they took his wallet. And he went home and he wrote something in his journal, in his diary, that might surprise you. And this is what he said. He said, Lord, I thank you that today I was robbed. He said, I thank you, first of all, that though I was robbed, I've never been robbed before. And I thank you, that, Lord, that though they took my wallet, they did not take my life. And Lord, I thank you that though they took my all, it wasn't actually very much. And he says, and I'm most thankful that though I was robbed, I was not the one doing the robbing. And so here was a man that got robbed and found four things to be grateful for in the midst of that. And let me just ask you, how many of you in the last 3 or 6 months have been robbed? You know, bike stolen, car broken in, house. Anybody been robbed here? A few hands going up. And I'm not going to, you don't have to shout it out loud, but how did you feel when you were robbed? I mean, you feel violated, you feel nervous, you feel that those feelings of vengeance and wanting to get it back, or that's what rises up. And yet when we look at this story, what he found in his misfortune was gratitude. Now let me reverse the question. How many of you in this room have not been robbed in the last 6 months? How many of you have not been robbed? See, you're the less fortunate ones here, right? Because you don't have anything to be grateful for. Maybe you'll get lucky and today on the way out, your car will be broken into. I can only hope. We were, as you know, I've talked about this recently, about our little trip to Eastern Europe this year. And one of the places we were in was in Hungary. And I was wondering about these people, and I'll tell you why. Of all the nations in Eastern Europe or in Europe, none of them have been conquered as many times as Hungary. I mean, they have been oppressed again and again and again. They were part of the Ottoman Empire, conquered by the Turks for many, many years. And then the Austrians conquered them and ruled them for several hundred years. And they finally had some level of democracy, and guess what? The Nazi Party rose up in the midst. And then the Second World War ended, and of all people to be liberated by it, they weren't liberated by the Canadians or Americans or Brits, but the Russians, who when they liberated them, put them into 45 years of Soviet occupation. And I'm wondering as I'm going to this country that had experienced so much hardship, and I wondered this question, and I wonder if these people are going to be bitter. It feels like they would be bitter. But you know what I found in Hungary? Instead, I found these highly educated, highly intelligent, and most enlightened people that have found gratitude in the midst of that. And in the 25 or so years of freedom that they've had, they're living life to the fullest. And they found a way to turn their lemons into lemonade. And I'll tell you, they had a lot of lemons. And I want to tell you one little story about this. Because almost at the end of the Second World War, in the fall of 1944, Hitler got frustrated with the Hungarian government, and he sort of forced them out. And another government rose up called the Arrow Cross. And the Arrow Cross were literally the Hungarian Nazi Party. And if that arrow and cross looks suspiciously like a swastika, that's on purpose. And these are not German Nazis. These are Hungarian Nazis. And they came to power for 5 months at the end of the Second World War. And this is their headquarters building, and it's a museum today, and it's called the House of Terror. And we visited this, and I don't know, look, just check that building out. Do you see that canopy up top? Do you see the shadow it casts? It reverses and it says terror on it. So if you don't know where the House of Terror is, there's the sign in the shadow. And so you go into this place, and it was the headquarters of this Arrow Cross political Nazi party. And in the basement, there was torture chambers and prisons, and you can see all that stuff. And so they only ruled for 5 months in Hungary. And in 5 months, they sent 80,000 people to concentration camps all over Europe. And then what they did, in broad daylight, in the streets of Budapest, they just shot people dead. And they don't even know the number, because they were just randomly and openly and without compunction just shot in the streets. And between 10 and 15,000 people lost their lives like that. And one of the things they did, one of the most terrifying things they did, was they would walk them to the edge of the Danube River. They would make them take their shoes off, and they would take their shoes off, and they would shoot them, and their bodies would fall in the Danube River, which has a strong current, and the current would just wash their bodies away. No harm, no foul, all done. And then they would take the shoes that they took off, and they would keep them or sell them, because in the World War, their shoes were very valuable. And so there was somewhere between 3,000 and 4,000 people lost their lives like that. They don't even know who these people were, just shot and their bodies gone forever. And so then in 2005, they erected a monument along the banks of the Danube River, and this is it, and it's called Shoes on the Danube Bank. And these shoes are period shoes from 1944, 1945, and they're cast iron, and they're embedded in the concrete. And they're a memorial to those that were shot dead on the banks of the Danube River. And when you go there, and when you see this, and when you begin to hear the story, it's hard not to have an emotional reaction. Now here's the thing, I had no frame of reference. I had never even heard this story before. And all of a sudden I found myself emoting. All of a sudden for these strangers of people so many years ago, I all of a sudden had these feelings. And it wasn't uncommon to be standing there and having people like this man in the picture who just came and bowed down and began to weep over these shoes for presumably complete strangers who had lost their lives. And as I sat there, and as at first there was this sense of horror and grief, then another emotion overcame me. And you know what that emotion was? It was gratitude that I was born and raised and live in Canada. And here I am in this country that hasn't experienced all those things. And all of a sudden, this sense of liberty and the fact that I live in this country, a country I didn't choose. I just happened to be born here. And by the grace of God, I live in the promised land as you do you. A land flowing of milk and honey. And if anybody needs to be grateful, it needs to be us. And there's so many people that whine and complain and are bitter about so many things in our society and demanding their rights. And I think, people, give your heads a shake. If anybody in this world should be people of gratitude, it should be us. And see, Thanksgiving makes for a better life, but we have to choose. We have to choose gratitude. It's like this poor man. He was in the doctor's office, and the doctor says, I have some bad news for you. You're bit by a rabid dog, and you have rabies, and there's no way we can save you. And the man took out a piece of paper and a pen, and he started writing madly. And the doctor said, what are you doing? Are you writing out your will? He says, no, I'm writing a list of the people I'm going to bite. So the first thing is that Thanksgiving makes for a better you. Second thing is that Thanksgiving makes for a better life. And the last and the final thing is that Thanksgiving makes for a better outcome. And this is sort of where we started, but this is where I want to land again. And you see, these other things, I think, are the rudiments of Thanksgiving, that we have this attitude of gratitude and we live it because it's the right thing to do. But here's the wonderful thing, that when we learn to give God thanks in advance, that's when God moves. Here's what the scripture says, 1 Thessalonians chapter 5. Listen carefully. It says, in everything give thanks, for this is the will of God in Christ Jesus for you. The will of God is for you to give thanks in everything. That means every good thing, right? No, that means everything. Everything, good and bad, in every situation you give God thanks. This next verse is a mind blower. Look at this. Ephesians chapter 5, verse 20. Giving thanks always for all things to God the Father in the name of our Lord Jesus Christ. Did you catch that? It's one thing to give God thanks in all things. It's another thing to give God thanks for all things. Oh, I had a car accident. Thank you, Lord, for this wonderful car accident. That's hard, right? It's hard, but that's what the scripture is telling us to do. And when we look at Jesus, when we look at Paul, they actually gave God thanks in the midst of their lack, not in their abundance. And that's when God begins to move on their behalf. Let me close with one final story here today. How many of you would recognize the name Corrie ten Boom? She wrote the book, The Hiding Place, and her sister Betsy were in Ravensbrück concentration camp in the Second World War. And one of the things Betsy did was, Betsy was a real prayer. They both were. And every morning she would wake up and she would thank God for everything. She'd say, thank you that we had a roof over our head last night. And I thank you for this blanket. And I thank you for the fleas that are infesting our barracks. And Corrie was always mad about that and said, why are you thanking God for the fleas? And she would say, Betsy would say, well, because God said to give him thanks for all things, so there must be a reason for the fleas, and so I'm going to give God thanks for the fleas. And of course, Corrie was all upset about that, but she couldn't stop her sister because her sister was a prayer warrior. Well, let me tell you the rest of the story. As it turned out, in Ravensbrück, their barracks was the only female barracks that the male guards did not come in and violate the prisoners. You know why? Because of the fleas. You see, that's how our God works. What will Thanksgiving do to your life? I'll tell you what, it'll make for a better you. It'll make for a better life. It'll make for a better outcome. There is nothing more powerful than this thing called thanks and an attitude of gratitude.
Church of the Rock has services every Sunday at 1397 Buffalo Place, and we invite you to join us when you're in the Winnipeg area. If you'd like a booklet to help you understand more about God's gift of forgiveness and reconciliation through Jesus Christ, please contact us, and we'd be happy to send you a free copy of the Book of Hope. visit our website at www.churchoftherock.ca. Thank you for watching, and God bless you.